Hi, this is Matt Burns from the University of Missouri, and I'm really excited to have the conversation today. We have two guests with us today. We have Dr. Elizabeth Stevens, who is an assistant professor at Georgia State University, and Dr. Christy Austin, who's an assistant professor at the University of Utah. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us. So today, the topic of conversation is a study that they recently completed, and I'm going to share my screen so everyone can see it. So here is with the two of them and three other co-authors from various universities. And the study was a meta-analysis that examined the effects of Orton Gillingham reading intervention for students, current state of the evidence, examining the effect of Orton Gillingham reading interventions for students with or at risk for word level reading disabilities. So what's cool about this one is this was a meta-analysis. This was a review of the research. And looking at something very specific. It's a cool study. It's raised quite a bit of buzz already. So I'm excited to continue this conversation. It's published in Exceptional Children. Now it's not out yet. It's still in press, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if people watching this want to get it, I'm afraid probably the best way to try to get it now is to email the authors and ask for it. But it should be out fairly soon, I would think. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So again, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Let's first start by asking, tell us more about the intervention that you studied. What was the study about?
Sure. So I'm happy to answer that, Matt, and thanks for having us. So this, I know you mentioned this in sort of in your intro, but this was an endeavor. We spent over a year working on this paper. It was a lot of hard work. And it was definitely a team effort. So we did this with Nancy Skamaka, Alexis Boucher, Clint Moore, and Sharon Vaughn at the University of Texas at Austin. So it was definitely collaborative. We were interested in looking at the effects of Orton Gillingham interventions on the reading outcomes of students with dyslexia. And the reason that we were interested in this, as many people who work with this population and researchers in the field know, that Orton Gillingham is a widely used, popular, and recommended oftentimes approach to teaching reading for this population of students. And one of the things that's really commonly associated with Orton Gillingham is the multisensory component of the instruction. So that involves really sight, hearing, sound, and movement, touch and movement. And it's the simultaneous use of those senses that's oftentimes, what's thought of as kind of the key ingredient in Orton Gillingham. And that's one piece of it. But one of the things that has come out of, there's really been a national movement recently to advocate for instruction for this population of students. And rightfully so, because students with word level reading difficulties and students with dyslexia have not received the type of reading instruction that they need in order to make progress. And so a lot of, there's been really a grassroots effort, parent advocacy groups and other groups that have really recommended for, and advocated for improved instruction for this group of students. So one of the things that's come out of that is state legislation. And so we know that many states have adopted dyslexia-specific legislation. And what some states have specifically identified are these Orton Gillingham programs for use with this population of students. Other states have not specifically mentioned in the laws that they've adopted Orton Gillingham, but the legislation will mention multisensory methods, which is oftentimes considered or thought about as OG. So Kristen Ritchie led a paper back in 2006 looking at the effects of Orton Gillingham. And so what she did is a systematic review of the literature, and she found 12 studies. And in this review, the findings really back in 2006 were that the methodological rigor of the studies was not great, and that the results were really unclear. She didn't find, in terms of the studies that had been conducted, that there was really evidence to support that this type of instruction improves significantly the reading outcomes of students with dyslexia. So given what's happened across the country with this emphasis in state legislation on students with dyslexia, and that this review was done nearly 15 years ago, or at least at the time we started this paper, it was nearly 15 years ago, Christy and I really wanted to update and extend this review. So now that we're in 2021, what additional studies may have been conducted? What is the current state of the evidence? What do we know from the studies that have been conducted about OG? And is it effective for this population of students? So that's really what we aim to do in this paper. And the other thing that we wanted to look at was whether or not we wanted to look at study quality. So we wanted to code for study quality so that we could say, do we have a lot of confidence in these findings based on the quality of the studies included?
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. So this was a meta-analysis. Can you describe your methods a little bit? Maybe number of studies, measures a little bit, that type of thing?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Because it's a meta-analysis, we were really interested in conducting what we would consider like a comprehensive search of all of the studies that have been conducted in this area. And so, rather than just conduct one study ourselves, we wanted to see, well, first, what do we know about Orton Gillingham interventions in general? Let's find every study that relates to this topic. And so we looked for both published and unpublished studies through the year 2019. That's when we stopped our search. And we were looking for studies that would have been classified as either experimental studies with random assignment, quasi-experimental studies, or single case design studies, looking at the effects of Orton Gillingham for students in grades K through 12 with dyslexia or word level reading difficulties. And so, one of the things that we had to do was identify what studies are we looking at. When we say Orton Gillingham, what does that mean? And so we really relied on the definitions from What Works Clearinghouse to identify Orton Gillingham studies. And What Works Clearinghouse, it defines Orton Gillingham as either these branded or what they consider unbranded programs. And so we use that to guide our definition and how we operationalized Orton Gillingham. We considered branded programs to be programs that are commercially available. They're based on the principles of Orton Gillingham, since Orton Gillingham is an approach to reading instruction, not a particular program itself. And then we also included what's considered unbranded programs. And What Works Clearinghouse defines those unbranded programs as, programs that are based on the principles of Orton Gillingham, but they're not necessarily commercially available. And so we relied on authors to sort of self-identify studies as including Orton Gillingham instruction or intervention to be included in our meta-analysis. And so, that was sort of how we identified studies. And we attempted to go through a really comprehensive systematic search so that we weren't missing any studies. We were identifying all studies related to this topic. And then once we identified our studies, we coded these studies based on a number of factors. And so, we looked at a lot of different things, but one of the most important things we looked at was the dependent variables in each article. And so, we coded studies as that looked at the effects of Orton Gillingham on students' word reading, oral reading fluency, phonological awareness, phonics, and spelling outcomes. And we called those foundational skill outcomes. And then we also looked at the effects of Orton Gillingham on students' vocabulary, listening comprehension, and reading comprehension outcomes. And we called those vocabulary and comprehension outcomes. And, we thought it was important to separate those two, knowing that these are interventions that are generally thought of as targeting sort of word level reading and spelling. And so, we thought it would be interesting to separate the effects on sort of those foundational skill outcomes the intervention programs really emphasize versus, these vocabulary and comprehension outcomes, which maybe aren't as emphasized, but are oftentimes improved through word level reading instruction. And then the final thing that we really looked at was we coded for study quality, knowing that previous review indicated that there was just this sort of dearth of study quality included in the studies that were conducted through the years 2006. We wanted to see how study quality continued to moderate the effects of these Orton Gillingham interventions. And so we coded study quality looking at research design. So we coded research design on a level of exemplary, acceptable, or unacceptable study quality based on whether or not a randomized control trial was used that included a sufficient number of participants. And then we coded study quality for comparison group instruction, knowing that the effects of these types of interventions differ based on what they're being compared to. And so we looked at, so some studies compared Orton Gillingham to students who received an actual alternate treatment in reading. And that was coded as exemplary. Some studies compared Orton Gillingham to an active control, but we really didn't have, so like a lot of times that might be a business as usual condition, but so many studies don't describe business as usual in enough sufficient description to really draw conclusions about what that instruction looked like. And then, some studies don't provide sort of any comparison condition instruction. It might be like a no treatment type of comparison group, or maybe just no information was provided. And so we really couldn't draw conclusions about that. And so that was the other area of study quality we looked at. And then finally, we looked at study quality in terms of implementation fidelity, knowing that if we're talking about Orton Gillingham, how was the intervention implemented as intended? And so, we coded quality as exemplary, acceptable, or unacceptable based on whether or not there were sort of clear replicable definitions of how the treatment was implemented, and whether or not the study indicated that the treatment was implemented with high degrees of fidelity above 75% to be coded as exemplary.
Wow, that sounds comprehensive. That's great. So then what did you find? Can you tell us some of your major findings?
Yeah, so Matt found, so the Ritchie review resulted in 12 studies, and we included those. Our search procedures differed a little bit, or our inclusion criteria rather, because she included studies conducted with college age students, and we did not. We focused on really K through 12 because that's really the area of emphasis in the state legislation. And so we included, I think, 6 of the original studies that she had in her 2006 review. And then we found a total of 24. So of the 24 studies included in this corpus, 16 were included in the meta-analysis. So some of those we weren't able to include in the meta-analysis, either because not enough information was reported for us to calculate effect sizes, or there was an insufficient sample size, so really small, less than 10 per group. So for the 16 that were included in the meta-analysis, the results, the mean effect size across those studies for the foundational outcomes was 0.32, but this was not statistically significant. And then the mean effect size for the vocabulary and comprehension outcomes was 0.14, and this was also not statistically significant. I think, and I'll let Christy speak a little bit about the results of the study quality, if that's okay with you, Christy. But I think, what the results show is that at this time, we don't have a body of evidence to really suggest that Orton Gillingham statistically significantly improve students' foundational reading outcomes over and above comparison instruction. So, but the caveat, of course, to that, we talk about this in the discussion, that an effect size of 0.32 is sizable, but so it suggests promise, but not confidence. So we just don't have confidence, and one of the main reasons for that is due to the overall limited study quality of those studies included in this corpus. So we interpret sort of everything with caution, because really what we walk away with and talk about in the discussion is that there are a lot of unanswered questions, and we need to do a lot more rigorous research with larger samples and rigorous research designs to really be able to answer more definitive questions, or to answer questions more definitively rather, regarding what are the effects of these interventions, and also how does OG compare to other explicit phonics or word reading interventions, and is it a better approach given sort of that multisensory component? Christy, do you want to say a little bit about the?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in terms of study quality, we analyze study quality in 2 ways. We provided a descriptive, descriptive statistics describing the study quality of the studies included in our meta-analysis. And, that review really indicated that overall, there just hasn't been enough high quality research done in the areas of research design, comparison group instruction, and implementation fidelity, that we need more randomized controlled trials with large samples. We need more studies comparing Orton Gillingham to other alternate reading treatments, particularly those that provide direct instruction in phonics that are not Orton Gillingham, based on the principles of Orton Gillingham instruction. And then, of course, we need studies implemented with high degrees of fidelity, so that when we're saying that we're measuring the effects of Orton Gillingham instruction, that, these are Orton Gillingham interventions being implemented the way Orton Gillingham is intended to be implemented. And so, overall study quality was poor. And I think in terms of the meta-analysis, what we really found was that study quality did not predict effect sizes in any of those areas, in research design, in the comparison group instruction, or in implementation fidelity. And what that tells us is that, with that study quality being so poor, like Liz said, we just still have a lot of unanswered questions, right? That although these practices are so firmly entrenched in policy and practice, that there really just isn't enough high quality research that has been done to draw definitive conclusions about these types of interventions.
Excellent, thank you. So you mentioned this is pretty consistent with the Ritchie 2006 paper. So is this consistent with the literature? Was it something that surprised you when you were doing the study?
Yeah, it really wasn't inconsistent with previous reviews. So it fell right in line with Ritchie's prior review that more high quality research is needed, and that current evidence just doesn't support Orton Gillingham as evidence-based based on the studies that have been conducted. But that, the major finding was that we need more high quality research to draw conclusions about these types of interventions. And not only did that fall in line with Ritchie's reviews, but they also fell in line with prior What Works Clearinghouse reports that investigated these branded and unbranded programs. So I don't think we were surprised.
Okay, thank you. So this is science. Science has limitations, as always. So I'll ask you to highlight what was one limitation from your study design.
Yeah, that's a good question, Matt. I think one of the things that I think we would have liked to have been able to say, more about the findings based on the corpus, but, due to the limited study quality, I think we were limited in what we could say. And, one of those, I know there's been some discussion, in some of the online forums about, the type of comparison instruction that students received. And, Christy and I are very much interested in, what are the effects of OG, compared to, say, just a business as usual reading intervention? And then what are the effects of OG compared to other explicit phonics instruction that is not OG? And we would have really liked to have been, and I think people want to know the answer to that question, and we would like to be able to answer that. But, one of the challenges that we ran into is that, when business as usual is not described with sufficient detail, you can't really say one way or another the extent to which explicit phonics was provided in that condition. So I think, that's one limitation that we would like to know more about, but we just couldn't due to the descriptions provided. And we would encourage researchers to really, describe the AU conditions in more detail, so that we, when it comes to doing a review like this, we can say more about something like that.
Excellent. Thank you. This is a really interesting paper. As someone who does meta-analytic research as well, I really enjoyed it and thought it was well done. I really appreciate you taking time to talk to me about it today.
Yeah, we appreciate you having us.
Fantastic. Thank you.